So now, what are foundations for is my topic. And I would like to talk to you all about open source foundations. I've got two affinities here that you can see. I'm still a director of the Open Source Initiative. They, of course, are very concerned about what I say. So they've got Zach down in the front row here, who's also a director, who's going to make sure that I only tell the truth. And I'm also still on the payroll at Wipro Technologies, although not for very much longer. So I have to tell you straight, please don't make any more open source foundations. Okay, we have enough of them. Please stop your employer from, or if you're the head of open source, please you stop making any new open source trade associations. We really have enough of them. I looked for a comprehensive list of them on the internet, and every list I looked at was out of date because there have been several created since the list was made. There's many, many, many of them, and they largely have the same roster of members, large corporations. And I'm going to try and explain that to you. Now, of course, as with all these things, there's always a caveat. You may find that there's a situation where you need to create a new foundation. But fundamentally, I have to say to you, please don't make any more. And I want to see you in my office tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock with slides, if you do intend to make another one, so we can have a good talking to you. So let's understand, first of all, why it is that people want to create foundations. What are the formal roles of foundations? The most important formal role of a foundation is to be an asset lock. Now, what do I mean by an asset lock? By an asset lock, what I mean is that the foundation guarantees that the assets that are being used for an open source project can only benefit the open source project, and that those assets can't be used to benefit one particular member. So you put a foundation in place to make sure that the trademarks or the aggregated copyright or the centralized funds can't be used solely to benefit one member. And often an organization will start a foundation as a way of symbolically guaranteeing that to its community, even when there's only one organization involved. Now, this applies to money, it applies to trademarks, it can apply to copyrights, it can apply to the direction of staff who are employed to make sure those staff act on behalf of the community and not of a single employer. But an asset lock is the key attribute of an open source foundation. Second one is to act as a bank. An open source foundation collects donations, distributes those donations in a way that helps the community. Typically, it will do that not by developing code, but by running conferences like this one, sometimes by putting out a tender for a function that the community is not able to bring the resources together to perform, such as putting together infrastructure. And it will spend money on sustaining the work products of those activities. So it will spend money on maintaining infrastructure and servers and so on. The third role is to be a guarantor of equality. Typically, the governance of an open source community will be anchored somewhere. So Jim talked about how he incorrectly said that Linus is the only guy that can let things into the Linux kernel. There's actually a group of people who collectively consent to things going in the Linux kernel. Linus happens to be the one who normally acts on their direction, but actually there's a collective group there. They are themselves anchored in the Linux Foundation, and Linus is an employee of the Linux Foundation, which acts as a kind of guarantor of his behavior, although I'm not sure how well that works out for Jim Zemlin. Then finally, a foundation is typically an infrastructure provider. So it's typically providing a repository, mailing lists, discussion forums. Increasingly, it's providing metrics and a business intelligence platform that interprets those metrics. And so those are really the four. That's why you start a foundation, is to do those four things. And the primary function of having a foundation is to be an asset lock. When I say foundation, foundation is a tricky word because it means different words are used in different English-speaking countries, different words are used in other languages to describe what's going on. By a foundation, what I mean is an organization which is recognized by the government for tax purposes as being independent of the control of a single entity. So, for example, in Germany, it might be a Stiftung or an EV. In the UK, it might be a registered charity or a community interest company. In the US, it might be a 501c3, a 501c6, or a public benefit corporation. All of those are the legal substrate that can lie underneath a foundation. But collectively, they are a foundation, and we use them in open source to perform these guarantee roles. Now, what is a community? Because it's actually a community that is the real primary force. The foundation is actually secondary to the nature of a community. An open source community is a group of individuals or a group of individuals acting at the behest of their employers who have overlapping self-interests. And those self-interests overlap in a code commons. And that's what an open source community is. An open source community is not primarily altruistic, although it's often difficult to function if you don't at least have a few good cells in your body. But primarily an open source community is about individuals seeking the satisfaction of some needs of their own. And an open source community works best when the ideologies and needs of the other participants in the community don't interfere with meeting your own needs. And so this is the reason why a foundation is able to work for an open source community, is that once an open source community has set itself up, once we understand what each other's roles and responsibilities are, we're able to then anchor those in a legal entity. But I'd suggest to you that the foundation legal entity is not the most important dimension of an open source foundation. I'd suggest that the most important element is actually the open source license. And the reason I say that is because the open source license that you pick embodies the values of the community that you're trying to form. So Jim talked, and unfortunately he spoke incorrectly about open source licenses, so I'd suggest that you don't take any notice of the categorization that he gave you. But open source licenses embody, for example, the desire of a community to be free to use code for any purpose without the need to make an offer of source. Or they embody the desire of a community to generally expect collaboration around the source code. Or they embody a desire by a community to propagate the idea of software freedom. Each of those things lie underneath a license, and as Ebba Moglen has said, an open source license is the constitution of a community. When you're trying to start a community, you start with the license, because the license embodies the realities of the community. The other reason you start with a license is because a license indicates that source code will actually be made available. And one of the biggest red flags for me about new open source projects that are being announced by corporations is often there's no source. And I've seen a couple of them starting up recently. I've gone to their website. I've gone to look at the source code. I can't find the source code. I've gone to look at the license. I can't find the license. They're saying it's going to be open source one day. Trust us. Come and join in. Well, when you see projects that don't identify the license or don't provide a clear access path to the source code, I'd suggest to you that they're not actually open source projects. Open source is not a badge that you wear, it's a reality that you live. And so something that badges itself as open source without making a commons freely available is probably not the real thing. If you're going to start a community, I suggest that the place that you start in picking your license and picking the theme for your community is in the middle of the categories of licenses. So Jim's right that there's 3 categories of licenses. I would suggest to you that they are reciprocal licenses, like the GPL or actually the LGPL is a reciprocal license. It's not a weak copyleft license, and if you treat it as one, you're going to get into deep trouble, trust me. In the middle, there are file-level reciprocal licenses, and at the other end of the scale, there are non-reciprocal licenses. And I'd suggest that you tend to start in the middle of the scale when you're designing your new community, when you're trying to work out what you're going to do. Pick, for example, the Mozilla Public License version 2, and find good reasons why you need to move either towards the GPL or towards the Apache license, which are the other two licenses you should pick. If you can't find an open source license that fits the way you want to start your community, I strongly suggest that you've got it wrong. Because there are 72, I think, is it 72 now? There's 72 open, I lose count. There's 72 open source licenses. They express every possible combination of motivations for a source community. And if you have got some motivation that doesn't fit one of those, it's probably you that's wrong. Please do not come to the OSI with a new license for approval, because we will ridicule you. We won't necessarily ridicule you. We might accept your license. We did just accept 2 new licenses. But you're going to have a rough ride, trust me on that. Open source licenses embody what are called the 4 freedoms. Let me simplify those 4 freedoms for you. They are the freedoms to use, study, improve, and share the software that's in front of you. By use, I mean use for any purpose without seeking further permission. By study, I mean you have access to the full source code that corresponds to the program that you're using. By improve, I mean, well, make any change, and I assume you're smart enough to make it better rather than worse. And by share, I mean you can take the original program or your improved version and give it to anyone you wish. Those 4 freedoms are not just an ethical imperative. They are actually the foundation for all the value that you and your business get from open source software. That freedom to use the software for any purpose means you can have a prototype-led, iterative development process where you use the software that seems best, do the thing that seems best with it, and then fail early if it turns out to be wrong. You're able to do that because it's open source software and you haven't had to get permission or make a commitment to it in advance. You can make a commitment to it after you've decided to be committed to it. Open source software also allows you to change readily as a result. So that freedom to use the software for any purpose is not just an ethical thought, it's actually a practical thought. It's what drives your software development and your deployment inside the enterprise. The freedom to study the software doesn't mean you have to study it, but it does mean you can hire experts who have studied it. And unlike with proprietary certifications, open source experts tend to have eclectic understandings of software. So if you hire a Microsoft certified professional, they're going to know about Microsoft products. But if you hire an experienced open source developer, they're likely to understand and know about a wide range of software products. And they're likely to be able to allow you to innovate and to create a richer solution for your business based on their freedom to study any of the source code that's open source. That means you can build in-house expertise to any level because of that freedom to study the source code. Or you can, of course, hire other people's experts by taking a support contract. It's up to you. You're free to mix and match whenever you want to. And that ability to understand the product intimately means that you are in control of your architecture at all times. And those 2 thoughts, that ability to decide whether you hire in or whether you outsource your support to a company, and that freedom to understand the product intimately and control your architecture, is the way you save money with open source. You don't save money with open source by not paying for licenses. If that's your justification, I guarantee that you will be wrong next year when you can't save the same amount of money. Instead, open source leaves you in control of your architecture, and it leaves you in control of your budget, and that's all because of this second freedom, the freedom to study. Thirdly, the freedom to improve the software means that you can participate in a rich marketplace. There's no entry fee into open source marketplaces. Anybody can take the code and improve it, or add plugins or add-ons or distributions or ports to new platforms. And so open source guarantees that rich marketplace that allows you to find a solution that fits your needs. There's no barriers to innovation created by the control of an individual party. And it means that escrow is built in. If your support provider goes out of business, somebody else will step in and do it. You don't have to worry about the situation where your proprietary vendor changes direction or gets acquired, and you're then left high and dry with no solution for your business. And then finally, that freedom to share means that you can deploy without barriers. It means you can do cloud without having to worry about individual product licenses. It means that you can give it to your employees and not worry they might be using it at home where you don't have a license. It means that you can share it with your partner ecosystems so they can use the same software as you, so that you can write software that develops your partner ecosystem and not worry about its licensing. And it means that you can give it to citizens and customers if you're a government organization or contracted to a government organization. So to summarize for you, the reason that open source is so important is because it delivers those 4 freedoms. The license guarantees those 4 freedoms. And once you have a community together under that license to deliver software, then you can consider creating a foundation to crystallize and to sustain the production of the software. Never start with the foundation. Always start with the license, the software, and the freedoms first, and then let the foundation make it permanent. The truth is that, like new open source licenses, we do sometimes need a new foundation. You sometimes look at the problem and you begin to see that in the middle of it there is something unexpected. And when a project is so large or so unique that it would overwhelm an individual existing host, then it's possible that you need to have a new project created. But just like with open source licenses, it's far better to assume that you don't need a new one and that you should look for an existing one that you can use. It's probably sitting there right in front of your eyes and you just hadn't realized it. So do look more closely and you'll discover it's there. Why is it that we do need foundations in a business environment? Oh, look, the bottom of the slide's cut off. The reason is because corporations are corporations. Now, I do another talk called Reptiles, which I won't do for you today, where I compare corporations to reptiles. Go look for the video online if you want to see it. There's a kinder version of that from a gentleman called Brian Cantrell, who compares corporations to lawnmowers. He says you should never trust a corporation because a corporation is just like a lawnmower. It exists to make money. Lawnmowers exist to cut the grass. If you put your hand in a lawnmower, it will cut your hand off. That's not because it hates you. It's because it's a lawnmower. And it's just the same with corporations. If you leave control of your open source project in the hands of a corporation, in the end, it will screw you. And if you want to avoid that, then you need independent governance that will stop it from happening. It's just inevitable. It's just gravity. It's not because they're bad. It's not because they hate you. It's because they're corporations. And consequently, the membership of an open source project which is anchored solely on a corporation will tend to be limited, because most individual developers have seen this story before, and they would rather not have their work and passion converted into the unshareable profit of somebody else. So foundations are really hard to start from scratch. I've watched quite a few open source projects get started in order to protect people from this bad actor problem. But it's a really hard thing to do, and it's very important that you've worked out your community behavior before you start your foundation, because the foundation will only make your failure permanent if you have failed before you start it. So make sure that you've got the layout and expectations of your community right. Pick between whether you're going to start a trade association or a public benefit foundation. These are two different things. It is possible to start a trade association foundation that serves public benefit. OW2 and Eclipse are examples. But it is very easy to start a trade association project which does not serve the public benefit. I won't give you examples. I will leave you to go look for yourself. In the US, they are almost always 501c6s. But that does not mean that a 501c6 is inherently bad. It simply means that the extra flexibility to be bad is in there. When it comes to public benefit corporations, I have yet to see a public benefit corporation which is not good. It's entirely possible that you could create one. As they become more and more popular, I expect we'll see more examples. But I generally trust an open source community that serves the public interest, like Apache or like OSI or like the Document Foundation. Each of those is an organization which is committed to a public benefit, and I consequently expect them to behave in the interests of every member of their community equally. Now, one of the reasons why trade associations are a problem is because they create a well-understood pattern for corporations. You see, a trade association is kind of like a standards body. It's a function which is created for the benefit of its members, and it has complicated rules. Now, back in the 70s and 80s, and I see there's a few other people in here who remember them as well, open standards were a novelty. They were started out in the 70s typically by governments to control the monopoly of one or two really large corporations, notably IBM and a group of companies called the Bunch, Burroughs, Univac, NCR, Cray, and Honeywell. And open standards were the way that governments tried to make sure that those vendors delivered to them something that didn't lock them in. And before long, those open standards turned out to be something that could be populated by the very companies that they were trying to control. And something that's called regulatory capture began to happen. And it turns out that if you create any system of rules, you have implicitly, with the system of rules, created the game that will eventually play it. And the corollary of this is when there are more rules, there are more ways to game the system. So you don't fix system gaming by creating rules to prevent it, because when you add more rules, you've simply created more ways to game the system. So today, the world of standards is a pretty evil space. I've even started a standards body. It's a pretty wicked place to be. You need very expensive professionals to represent your company's needs in those communities. They can arouse great passions when they're gamed. I actually even saw once a public protest on the streets of Copenhagen, protesting against the way that one corporation had gamed the standards system and begging the standards body to intervene and stop the gaming. So when it comes to a big foundation today, honestly, a trade association foundation is the ideal game surface. So if you look at a large trade association-style open source community like OpenStack, for example, it has a huge board. It has a huge political playing surface. And to be fully represented there, you probably need to employ standards professionals, repurposed as open source professionals, to go and navigate the political intrigues that are in the organization. And so this is, for me, the core reason why I beg you not to start more of these things. I beg you to start organizations that focus on the code and on the license, and to separate powers. A well-structured open source foundation has a separation of powers. This is like, I don't know how many people here have read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It's quite good. Yeah, certainly the people down the front have. Jolly good. I don't know if you remember this scene from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. This is on the Golgafrincham B arc. Just to sum up for you, the planet of Golgafrincham had very wisely sent all of its intermediaries off in advance of the rest of civilization when they were facing some sort of existential threat to their planet. And so they put all the middle management, the management consultants, the telephone sanitizers, the hairdressers, all onto one spaceship to make sure the planet had, clean telephones when everybody was evacuated eventually. And on the A arc that was going to leave later, that was where all the thinkers were going to be. And on the C arc, all the doers were going to be on the C arc. And the B arc went out ahead. And it's worth looking at the script for this. I've got a link in. If you download my slides, there's a link in the notes to the script for this section. A well-organized open source foundation is structured with a B arc. The B arc is where you send your VP of strategy to go and negotiate with other VPs of strategy about what's going to happen in the project. And you make sure that that committee, that whatever it is, the advisory board, the board of directors, has no control whatsoever over the engineering direction of the project. You make sure that there's a separate engineering steering committee that looks after the technical direction of the project. And then they can argue about what the membership fee is going to be and how the project's going to be structured. And meanwhile, the engineers can get on with actually making decent code in the engineering steering committee. If you look at all the most successful open source foundations, you will discover that they are all equipped with a B arc, so that the management can't get in the way of progress and innovation. It may be cruel to call it a B arc, I don't know. To be more serious for a second, some foundations are useful. How can we identify the good ones? Well, they have a number of attributes. They have the separation of powers that I've described. They have a mission which is in the public benefit rather than serving an individual corporation. They use an OSI-approved license. They have an asset lock that guarantees that their work product can only be used for the benefit of the community that they serve. And they have some sort of representative governance. I'm very cautious about the word meritocracy, because meritocracy normally means government by people just like the people who founded the organization. And I'm not sure that that's what you always want. I think you want representative governance rather than necessarily a meritocracy. But certainly an organization should have an elected leadership body and membership rules that ensure that only the current contributors are the ones that get a vote in electing that leadership body. So the problem that I first described is not really that there are too many community interest open source organizations. The problem is epitomized by this slide from New York. This is you see, you know, the Statue of Liberty here. This is the New Jersey docks in the background. You see the dock cranes are all in the posture of the Statue of Liberty, wanting you to believe that liberty and commerce are the same thing, just in different forms. And, well, I don't believe they are. I believe that the key to software, to open source software is software freedom, is your liberty. And I believe that has to be explicitly guaranteed. And minimizing it or mitigating it in the pursuit of commerce always leads you to less successful commerce. So it's very worthwhile to make sure that you create a body, an organization which is anchored on that software freedom principle. Firstly, because the organization will work better that way, and secondly, because the benefit that you're trying to derive is actually arising from the software freedom. I sometimes wonder whether we should just stop talking about using that word foundation altogether, whether we should find some other term to indicate a true gathering of equals. I don't know what that word would be. That would be a great thing to discuss over lunch, I think. So don't confuse liberty and commerce. They're different things. That's not to say that all community interest organizations are perfect. Even beautiful things can get desperate. Even beautiful things can fail. This one was in Amsterdam, just in case you were worried, on Damrak. Even the best open source project that's ever been created, which is the Apache Software Foundation, is susceptible to gaming and has a number of projects that are the result of corporations executing well-funded plans against their rules. And again, over lunch, I'll tell you their greatest failed projects if you'd like to hear about them. You also need to make sure that your rules are not giving hostages to fortune. You never know what's going to happen next. You never know what's going to drop out of the sky on top of you. Things can go seriously wrong if the hands that are sustaining it change. Just look at Java, for example, which many of us thought was safe once we put it under the GPL, but turned out to become yet another competitive attack surface in the hands of Oracle. So as I say, given any large system of rules, there's a game that's waiting to be played. So you're better off building on the experience of others rather than to try and invent it yourself. If you want to create a new foundation, please don't until you've been absolutely convinced that Apache, Software Freedom Conservancy, or SPI, or Eclipse, or OW2 can't provide you with a home for what you want to do. Because you're much safer in a proven structure than you are in trying to create your own. When you try and create your own, you're at great risk of great failure, and I suggest that you avoid that. So you've decided to just ignore everything I've been saying for the last half hour and start a new foundation. Well, what should you do? Well, the number one thing you should do is make sure you don't only talk to lawyers. You should really make sure you speak to people who've created communities before, because you have to start your design from the perspective of the community of developers, rather than from the perspective of the control of risk. And lawyers will always start your discussion from the perspective of control of risk. So go to them to control the risks that arise from your choice of a structure for the foundation, rather than asking them to design it for you. Secondly, put software freedom first. Software freedom is not just the FSF's crazy ideology. This is the president of OSI telling you, or the former president of OSI telling you this, that software freedom is key. It's where all the business benefit that you are pursuing comes from. So start from there in your design. Don't start from some business plan. Start from software freedom. Equality is everything. Don't create an uneven playing field. Avoid, for example, contributor license agreements. Try and use license in, license out. Avoid anything that gives one party in the community rights that the others don't have. Because if you do that, you will restrict the number of people who participate, and you will also create a hostage to fortune for the future. And then transparency is everything as well. Make sure that anyone new coming into the community can find out what happened before and the reason that things are as they are. The great benefit of Apache is they have a rule that says that if it didn't happen on the mailing list, it didn't happen. And, okay, so you don't want a mailing list, so use a forum or use something else. But make sure that your decision tree is always visible to everybody who comes into the organization. Plan conflict resolution in advance, have a code of conduct, have a group of people with consensus about what the code of conduct is going to be and how it's going to operate. There's no point trying to put together your code of conduct once the fight has started. Get everything that you're doing in writing, and don't rely on verbal agreements between people. And finally, incorporate wisely. Pick a really good destination to incorporate. At the moment, I'm recommending people come to the UK and start community interest companies, but think very carefully about where you're going to incorporate. You'll find that if you've got American members to your community, they will suggest that you become a 501c3 in Delaware. And the reason they'll suggest that to you is because of the tax benefits to American corporations. But I'm not convinced that that's the right answer for everybody. And see above as well. So enough foundations already. I think we've got enough of them. I don't want any more. If you're going to have to make one, well, you know, so be it. You know, what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. But really, it would be best if you didn't create any more. Thank you very much for your time and for your attention.